beach. It was a picturesque stretch of coastline in the Pacific Northwest, known to locals as Serpent's Cove. The beach was hidden away from the world, accessible only by a winding, narrow road that cut through a dense forest of towering pines. The area had an eerie beauty. Jagged cliffs loomed over the shoreline, and the waves crashed relentlessly against the rocks, sending up sprays of saltwater that glittered in the pale sunlight. To the untrained eye, it was a serene and beautiful place, but the locals knew better. For decades, Serpent's Cove had been the center of chilling legends, whispered tales of disappearances, strange occurrences, and a malevolent presence that seemed to haunt the area. The stories varied, but they all shared one common thread. Those who visited Serpent's Cove often returned with disturbing memories, or not at all. It was mid-August when a group of friends, Sarah, Mark, Jenny, and Tom, decided to visit the beach for a weekend getaway. They were all city dwellers, weary of the constant noise and hustle of urban life. The idea of spending a weekend at an isolated beach, far from civilization, sounded like the perfect escape. Mark had heard about Serpent's Cove from an old co-worker who mentioned it in passing, describing it as a hidden gem that few knew about. Intrigued by the idea of exploring an unspoiled, quiet beach, he suggested it to the group, and they all eagerly agreed. The journey to Serpent's Cove was uneventful, but as they descended the narrow road towards the beach, an uneasy feeling began to settle over the group. The forest grew denser, the air colder, and the road seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, the trees parted, revealing the secluded beach. The cove was just as beautiful as Mark's co-worker had described, yet there was something unsettling about it, a feeling of isolation that went beyond the mere absence of people. They set up camp near the edge of the beach, where the sand met the tree line. The air was thick with the scent of salt and pine, and the sound of the waves was a constant, rhythmic background noise. The group spent the afternoon exploring the beach, collecting shells, and enjoying the rare tranquility. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the beach, the atmosphere started to change. The wind picked up, howling through the trees with a low, mournful sound, and the temperature dropped rapidly. A thick fog rolled in from the ocean, creeping inland and swallowing up the beach in a dense, white blanket. The first night, as night fell, the group gathered around a campfire, sharing stories and laughing. But the laughter soon faded as the fog grew thicker, and the firelight seemed to barely penetrate the heavy mist. The sound of the waves, once soothing, now seemed ominous. Each crash of water against the rocks echoing like a distant roar. Suddenly, Tom froze, his eyes fixed on something in the fog. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. The others turned to where he was staring, but saw nothing except the swirling mist. "See what?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with concern. "There was someone out there?" Tom insisted, pointing towards the water. "A figure? Just standing there." Mark laughed nervously. "Come on, man. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. This place is creepy as hell, but it's just fog and shadows." Tom didn't respond. He continued to stare into the mist, his face pale. The group tried to shake off the unease, but the mood had shifted, and the fun and relaxation of the afternoon seemed like a distant memory. As the night wore on, they decided to turn in, retreating to their tents. But sleep did not come easily. The fog seemed to press in on them from all sides, muffling sounds and distorting perceptions. The air inside the tents was cold and damp, and each of them lay awake, listening to the distant crash of the waves, their minds racing with thoughts of Tom's mysterious figure, the disturbing discovery. The next morning, the fog had lifted slightly, but the sky remained overcast, casting a gray pallor over the beach. As they emerged from their tents, the group noticed something strange. The beach, which had been pristine the day before, was now littered with seaweed, driftwood, and something else. Something that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Scattered across the sand were dozens of small, hand-carved, wooden figurines, each one intricately detailed and disturbingly lifelike. They were shaped like people, men, women, and children, all frozen in various poses of terror. Some were huddled together, others appeared to be running, but all of them had the same haunting expression: wide eyes and open mouths, as if they were screaming in silence. "Where did these come from?" Jenny asked, her voice trembling as she picked up one of the figurines. It was cold and damp to the touch, and she quickly dropped it, as if it had burned her. "There's no one else here," Mark said, his voice shaking. "We would have heard if someone had come by." Tom was silent, staring out at the ocean, his face pale. "I told you I saw something last night," he finally said. I think whatever it was, it left these." The group was unnerved, but they tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a prank, or perhaps someone had left them there before they arrived. They decided to explore the beach further, hoping to find some explanation, but the more they searched, the more disturbing things became. As they walked along the shoreline, they found more figurines, partially buried in the sand or wedged between rocks. But what terrified them the most was what they found near the water's edge, a set of footprints leading from the ocean to the shore. The prints were deep and wide, much larger than a human's, and they stopped abruptly a few feet from where the first figurine had been found, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. The second night, by the time they returned to camp, the group was on edge. The beach, which had seemed so inviting the day before, now felt like a trap. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees, and the fog was thickening once more. Despite their fear, they had no choice but to spend another night at Serpent's Cove. The narrow road leading out of the area was too dangerous to navigate in the dark, and they decided it was safer to wait until morning to leave. As night fell, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The fog closed in around them, and the sounds of the waves grew louder, almost deafening. The campfire flickered weakly in the damp air, casting long, twisted shadows across the sand. Then came the voices. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the wind and the waves, but as the night wore on, they grew louder, more distinct. The voices were whispering, unintelligible words carried on the wind. The group huddled closer together, their faces pale with fear. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "Yes," Mark replied, his eyes wide. "But I can't understand what they're saying." The voices grew louder still, until they were no longer whispers, but low, guttural sounds, like a chorus of moaning and crying. It was as if the very air around them was alive with the sound of suffering. Tom stood up suddenly, his eyes wild with fear. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't care if it's dark. We have to leave now." But as he spoke, the fog seemed to thicken even more, pressing in on them from all sides. The wind howled through the trees, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, and the air was filled with the scent of salt and decay. Then, From the darkness beyond the firelight, they saw it. The figure that Tom had seen the night before. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs and a face that was obscured by the shadows. It moved towards them slowly, deliberately, its movements unnatural and jerky, as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. The voices grew louder, more frantic, as the figure approached. The air was thick with the sound of crying and screaming, and the group was paralyzed with fear. The figure stopped just outside the circle of firelight, its face still hidden in shadow. For a moment, there was silence, complete and utter silence, as if the world had stopped. Then, in a voice that was both ancient and hollow, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The words echoed in the air, sending a wave of cold terror through the group. The figure began to move again, slowly retreating into the fog, its body disappearing into the darkness, but the voices remained, growing louder and more frantic, as if begging for release. The group didn't wait to see what would happen next. They grabbed their belongings and fled, leaving the campfire burning and the disturbing figurines behind. The fog seemed to follow them, pressing in from all sides, and the voices chased them, echoing in their ears as they ran towards the road. The escape. It felt like an eternity before they reached the car, the fog swirling around them like a living thing. They piled in, Mark fumbling with the keys in his panic, and as soon as the engine roared to life, they sped away from Serpent's Cove, the narrow road twisting and turning beneath the tires. The voices faded as they drove, but the fear lingered, clinging to them like the dampness of the fog. No one spoke as they drove through the night. The only sound, the hum of the engine and the distant crash of the waves. When they finally reached civilization, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the world. They didn't stop until they were miles away from the beach, and even then, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something dark and ancient following them. The aftermath. The group never spoke of Serpent's Cove again. They went their separate ways, each of them haunted by the memories of that night. Sarah couldn't sleep without hearing the voices, and Tom's dreams were plagued by the figure in the fog. Jenny refused to go near the ocean, and Mark, who had suggested the trip in the first place, was consumed with guilt. Years later, Sarah heard a news report about a group of teenagers who had gone missing near Serpent's Cove. Their bodies were never found, but the police discovered a collection of small, hand-carved figurines scattered across the beach. The legends of Serpent's Cove continued to grow, and the beach remained a place of fear and mystery. The locals still warned visitors to stay away, to ignore the call of the ocean and the beauty of the shore. For Serpent's Cove was a place where the past and present intertwined, where the dead did not rest, and where those who ventured too close to the water's edge might never return. And though the group had escaped with their lives, they knew that Serpent's Cove had left its mark on them, a shadow that would follow them for the rest of their days. For some journeys are best left untraveled, some mysteries are best left unsolved, and some places are best left undisturbed. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We'll be back with more fascinating stories from the world of crime. Until then, stay curious and stay safe.